I just want to say how moved I am to be with Peace Action now. We need peace action now, truly more than ever. It in this moment of, I mean, I think it's fair to say, violence, civil war, and the insanity of, you know, ramping up the nuclear situation. Both the U.S. and the U.K. have announced that they are going to uh, spend more money on nuclear weapons and disaster and stockpiles. And Amy Goodman, democracynow.org, everybody should go online and see her program from 2 days ago where this was announced and discussed. And peace action is what we need. And of course, peace action, founded in 1957, stands on the former wonderful groups of people who founded the Women's Peace Party, which became the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And then there was Women's Strike for Peace. And to introduce this fabulous evening, and I'm so very moved to have been asked to do that, there was a group around Crystal Eastman, and I'm happy to say that my book on Crystal East, wonderful articles from the uh, well, from the teens and the 20s when she was active with um, the members of Colleen Jenkins' family. We're going to talk about it in a minute. Let me just read. In 1921, when women got the vote, which is what is going to be a very big part of our evening tonight, she gave a talk. She wrote an article, April 1921, in which she quotes Sarah Bod Field's presentation to Congress, where they deliver a statue of Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she says, Mr. Speaker, we do not commit to your keeping merely a block of marble, but we commit to your keeping blood red memories alive and pulsing. It is universal freedom for which this movement, represented by these women, stood. The very first suffrage association aimed to enfranchise the Negro as well as the woman. Hence, our demand must now go beyond women. It must extend to the farthest bounds of the principle of the consent of the governed. I don't speak in terms of bloody revolution, but in terms of radical change. Men and women are not yet free. The slavery of greed endures. Little child workers, the hope of the future, are sacrificed to industry. Young men are sent out to die for profits. We must destroy industrial slavery and build industrial democracy. The people everywhere must come into possession of the earth and be free. And that is the legacy of the speakers this evening. And so let me introduce Colleen Jenkins, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Colleen is a legislator, author, television producer. Over the years, she used her talents to inspire awareness and pride in women's history. She is the co-founder and president of the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Trust. The Trust's leading practice fulfills its mission to preserve the history of the women's rights movement, to educate the public, to promote the advancement of women's rights. A resident of Greenwich, Connecticut, where for 30 years she has served as a municipal legislator. Maybe you should run for president, Colleen. How about that? She co-authored a book, 33 Things Every Girl Should Know About Women's History, and produced the television documentary, An American Revolution, Women Take Their Place. 2009 testimony before the US Senate contributed to the passage of federal legislation which created a national trail of historic sites, coordinated by the Women's Rights National Historical Park, the National Votes for Women's Trail. And for the past 6 years, she has been vice president of monumentwomen.org, which was founded in part by Gary Ferdman and Miriam Mizrayan, his wife, who really had the vision to create, where are the women who had a vision to create the incredibly wonderful statue erected in Central Park, the first, imagine that, statue of women Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth in recognition of the centennial of the 19th Amendment of the US Constitution. Colleen Jenkins came from a long line of women activists. In addition to her great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her great-grandmother, Harriet Stanton Black, was a major organizer of the women's suffrage movement in the militant period, which is what I was referencing in Crystal Eastman's essay, the 1913-1915 period, and finally in 1919, it happened. So in 1920, I suppose. So thank you, Colleen, for being here, and Colleen Jenkins, over to you.
Thank you, Blanche. It's a great honor to be with you all during this house party and to be able to celebrate, most importantly, peace and action. And one can look at the suffrage movement as an example of peace and action. Its nickname is called the world's greatest bloodless revolution. And I would say they used every arrow in their quiver to carry on this revolution. The only thing they didn't use was the gun. So by way of introduction, and Marguerite and I are going to tell about our family as individuals, but also as this enormous movement that lasted basically 72 years. And this is my grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This is how she is most remembered, but I'm most proud of this family photo that's not very well known. Here she's a 32-year-old, and she's a revolutionary. She's involved with calling the first Women's Rights Convention. And at that convention, they had to create some type of document for them to get their messages across. And they said, this is as hard as inventing a steam engine. Well, what they did, they came across a great idea. Take the Declaration of Independence of the United States and take those ideas that were very familiar and apply them to women. For instance, they said, or Elizabeth read this document at the convention, all men and women are created equal. They're endowed with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which is great. It's an irrefutable argument, but also it takes our values that we had been fighting with as a nation and applies them to 51% of the population. And in this document, they talk about demand elective franchise, which obviously is the vote in 1848. So my point is that this is an unfinished revolution. We're constantly evolving, but there's tremendous efforts, particularly this year, the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And what is that 19th Amendment? What is it? What is it? I love it. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And then it simply says Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. I mean, that's good in 1920, but it's also good today, as we well saw in the recent presidential election. So what I'd like to do is speak about two of your colleagues, Gary and Miriam, who walked through Central Park one day, and they had their eyes open in this park that's over 800 acres, and they ask a critical question: where are the women? Central Park is a quintessential public forum of free speech, free assembly. So where are the representations, the statues of real women? They only found Alice in Wonderland, Mother Goose, a witch. And they said, no, we have to have real women. So now I have a brief video of the unveiling of the first statue in Central Park that is of real women who are pioneers in the women's suffrage movement. And I kick it over to you all to enjoy this film about enduring success. This statue will live longer than we will.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Would you please stand up? Thank you, Meredith. It's gorgeous. Everyone will have an opportunity to take as many photos as you want in just a moment. And now we will find out if the Today Show is finished and then move along with the program.
I was born a slave in Ulster County, New York. They called me Isabella Baumfree, but after I left that house of bondage, I gave myself a new name, Sojourner Truth.
I was born Elizabeth Cady in Johnstown, New York. When I married Henry Stanton, we first lived in Boston, but then moved to the outskirts of Seneca Falls in upstate New York.
I am Susan B. Anthony. I was born into a Quaker, anti-slavery family, and as a young woman became a teacher.
We little dreamed when we began this contest, optimistic with the hope and buoyancy of youth,
that half a century later, we would be compelled to leave the finish of the battle to another generation of women.
But my friends, there is an army of them now where we were but a handful.
With such women consecrating their lives, failure is impossible.
Today, we present a labor of love to you, to New York, and to the world. A labor of love is done for the love of the work itself, done without any assurance that the work will be rewarded, and done with all the intensity that drives us, intensity that is never easily welcomed by those around us. I've labored to make these bronze figures embody what each of these three women most loved. Sojourner Truth loved speaking the truth. Her voice was her weapon and her art. It was said of her that she carried the people by storm, possessing a heart of love and a tongue of fire, combining power and sweetness in that great warm soul and that vigorous frame. Here, among this collection of statues, she will be, as Nell Irvin Painter called her, the electrifying black presence in the white crowd. Susan B. Anthony loved to organize, strategize, and win. Stanton compared her to a Doric column. So simply, so grandly she stands, supporting her one vast idea, the enfranchisement of women. Anthony once complained to her diary, "I love to make history, but hate to write it." Elizabeth Cady Stanton loved to write. Vivian Gornick wrote that for Stanton, only the love of thinking could harness the resentment over inequality. It gave her the energy to care for 5, 6, 7 children during the day and sit down at midnight at the kitchen table to write a 2-hour speech that demanded to know what it means to be a human being. These three women loved freedom and wanted it for themselves. They led a revolution against the definition of woman that denied them the liberty to fulfill themselves. They made common cause to fight for the abolition of slavery and the right to vote. Look at them and realize that at this moment somewhere, women are sitting together at a kitchen table working to change the world. And now, Parks Commissioner Mitchell Silver, who lifted a 70-year moratorium on new statues to welcome this monument.
I am honored to welcome these women's rights pioneers to Central Park. Welcome home, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth. With this work, we pay tribute to the monumental accomplishments of these brave and dynamic women who fought for equal rights. Their work still impacts us 100 years later. This sculpture is the first in Central Park in decades, and there's no better way to break our moratorium than this tribute. As the first monument in Central Park depicting real women, it highlights the importance of equity in our parks and beyond. Equity is at the forefront when we envision public spaces so they serve all New Yorkers. This work embodies our present values and affirms what can be accomplished with collaboration and resolve. 1 century after the 19th Amendment was ratified, it is clear we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that all voices are heard. These women fought for what they believed in and held on to hope despite challenges. Like them, in a time of crisis, we hold on to hope and unveil this statue in an election year when we can see the nation's first women vice president. Parks and public spaces and those we honor in them are fundamental to the practice of democracy. In the most democratic of parks, this statue of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth reinforces the principles of democracy for generations to come.
2 million people visit Central Park each year, and soon they will finally see some real monumental women. It is fitting that the first statue of real women depicts 3 New York women who dedicated their lives to fighting for women's rights. This monument conveys the power of women working together to bring about revolutionary change in our society. It invites people to reflect not just on these great women and their work for equality and justice, but on all the monumental women who came before us. It's an instant history lesson. It challenges us to continue the fight for full equality for women in our lifetimes. Our Women's Rights Pioneers Monument will make a lasting statement to all future visitors in Central Park, a message written in stone and shaped in bronze that we all can and must move history forward.
What does this monument mean to me? It means hope. As a 7th generation granddaughter of Sojourner Truth, this monument isn't just here to remind us of our past. It's not just here to remind us of the works that these 3 amazing women accomplished, but it's here to remind our future, to continue to stand up for what's right. Continue to stand up for what you believe in. Continue to stand up for equality, for equal justice. Continue to stand up for what you know is true, what you know is good, and what you know is right. It's here to remind us to continue to stand. As this statue stands, so shall we.
Hi, I'm Jocelyn Hallowell Wolf, a direct descendant of suffragette and abolitionist Lucretia Mott. One thing I particularly admire about my powerhouse Quaker granny is how she gave her equal devotion to both advocating for the rights of women and working to abolish slavery. Now, I'm only 12 years old, but I strongly encourage you, no matter what your age, situation, skin color, gender, or anything else may be, to become aware, to get active, to never lose hope, and to join us in the fight that we've been fighting for centuries. Thank you for, in her words, being no advocate of passivity.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this. And now for a colleague of mine, Marguerite. She and her family have also worked tirelessly for the human rights.
Hello.
I think I'm going to introduce you, Marguerite.
Okay, go ahead, Blanche.
Marguerite Kearns grew up in the Philadelphia area, learning about her family history. And I have to say, really stirring, Pauline, a really stirring video. Never give up, keep activist, and failure is impossible. And those are the words that motivate, I think, Marguerite Kearns as she explores her family history, the author of An Unfinished Revolution, Edna Buckman Kearns, and the Struggle for Women's Rights. The book is to be released by SUNY Press on June 1st. It is available for pre-order. It tells the story of how Marguerite's grandparents, Edna and Wilma Kearns, were active in the suffrage and peace movements in the early 20th century, and how they passed their values and activism on to their children and grandchildren. And Marguerite, who has been a teacher and a journalist, is a brilliant recipient of those values. And we are very grateful that peace action is part of this ongoing, really inspiriting journey. Thank you very much. Marguerite, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Marguerite, of course, and I'm here to talk about my book, but I'm really going to talk about my family. And it's coming out this summer, but it didn't start that I was going to sit down and write a book. It started when I decided that I didn't want any more tea towels from my mother, no more blenders. I wanted to find out, why am I the way I am? And I knew a little bit about my grandmother and grandfather because at the age of 10, I started to ask questions. My grandmother died in 1934, but my grandfather, he wanted to take care of this wagon, which now is in the New York State Museum. And it took a long time to imagine it coming out of the warehouse and being put out for everyone to see. And that's what's happened. And so I said to myself, not only I am going to write about what I learned over the years, but this is a pitch tonight for everyone to pass on the stories of you and your families so that we can have what's called intergenerational activism. And I'd love to say that we can just snap our fingers and end war, and we can end all kinds of issues that plague us. But the fact is that sometimes these take generations, and occasionally and often our job is just to keep the issues alive. And so we're standing on the shoulders of those who've come before us. And I got goosebumps a little while ago when I was watching some of the video. The unveiling of the statue in Central Park, New York, is it just took a few seconds, but it took years to manifest this. And I think that the book that I've written is just an example of what people can be doing in their own families, even if it starts yesterday. We're standing on the shoulders of incredible work that has been done, and most of these people were volunteers. And as we've learned in this pandemic, many stories and many important accomplishments have been lost. And it's not just the accomplishments, it's also what goes on in our heads. What the wheels turn and we say, what am I going to do about this? And it's not just signing a petition, it's making a commitment to something that's much larger than ourselves, and that's peace and freedom, and the freedom to be who we really are, the freedom to live in a peaceful world, the freedom to have neighbors and people that just we love and adore, and we help each other, and the community, and everything that goes along with that. We take it for granted when it's here, and we miss it when it's gone. And so that's what I'd like to talk about. I'd like to show you some of the photographs from the book. There's over 100 images, many of them from my collection. On the cover, you see a picture of my grandmother. She's to the right of that really tall man, and there she is. And she's marching with her family. This was a family affair. And that's my grandmother, Edna Buckman Kearns. And then the little girl in the middle is my mother's older sister. And the man to her right is my grandfather. And if it wasn't for my grandfather and my mother, I wouldn't have heard all the details of these stories. And I was a child who loved stories. And so I said to myself when I sat down to write the book, I want to make this storytelling. I want to make it real. But I also had to do a lot of work. I had to study. I had to read books. I can't tell you how many barrels of used paper that were carried out of my house, because I wanted to tell people about my grandmother, even if it was just a gift to my family. And that's what it started out. It was just going to be a gift. And now I realize that it's an important contribution to the story that we're all part of. And that is how this fits into the life of a family. and so I told the story of my family. It's not a complete story of the peace movement of their times. It's not a complete story of the suffrage movement of their times. It's a story of, I'm the narrator of the story, and I talk about what it was like for me when I was very young, and no one in my school ever heard of the suffrage movement, and I demanded that my mother tell me why I was the way I was, and this involved 10 years of her working with me when I lived in upstate New York, and my grandmother and grandfather were New Yorkers. They lived in both Manhattan and also Long Island, and to the left is my grandmother, and her phone is right here. It's a little battered, and it's all the pieces aren't there, and the cord is frayed, but she smiled and dialed, and she worked hard, and that's the phone. And then she this is corn that she canned, fresh corn, to raise money for the movement, and they called it the cause. And she organized all kinds of things, from petitions to you see what people to march in parades. She took action herself. She was a reporter. She worked for many small newspapers and large newspapers as a columnist. I'm in New Mexico, so I have to take a sip every once in a while because my mouth gets dry, and it's a very dry environment. But I love to talk about my grandmother because she is one of tens of thousands of Americans who really committed themselves to peace, freedom, and equality and social action. And she was a 9th generation Quaker, so these were principles and values that she just grew up and just took for granted. But I think as she looked around the world, she saw that not everyone had the same perspective. And so to the right here is her parade dress. There's the sash that's up there. She wore that across her dress. And when I was a kid, my mother said to me one day, "Oh, take these clothes, take Edna's clothes and go play with them." Well, I think she would have just not even wanted to admit that she had ever done that. But once those clothes hit my body, I think I was hooked. I was hooked, and I knew that something was going to happen in my lifetime, but I had to listen first to the stories. And so can we move to the next slide, please? Here they are. My grandmother is in the middle here. It's 1902. There she is in a Quaker bonnet. As my grandfather to the right, Wilmer Kearns, saw her. He was a student in Philadelphia, and they met on the street when she dropped her art portfolio. And he was from Pennsylvania, and they didn't have very much in common at that time. His ancestors and family members fought in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. And his mother was in a Civil War orphan school in central Pennsylvania. And so I think she kind of knew that she better check out the values, and so she said, "Let's just be friends." And he fell for her right away. You can see why. And so this is him as a young man, as a student in Philadelphia, and he persisted. And those days, central Pennsylvania was the frontier, and men and women worked together. They had to. It was part of survival. But there to the left is their wedding photograph on June 8th, 1904. And they had a Quaker wedding outside of Philadelphia. And she didn't have the simple Quaker dress, but they had a friend's ceremony, and their family members gathered around when they repeated the words to each other, "In the presence of God and these our friends, I take thee." And he committed himself to become a Quaker, and he became a peace activist, and he supported everything she did. So when she went away to a conference, or she went away to be part of a demonstration, he stayed home and did childcare. And so this was a family affair. And I think this was his I think this is what my grandfather did that my grandmother loved. He was part of the 1904 Peace Congress in Boston, and that's a picture that's not in my book, but Ashley found it, and I said, "Oh, that's perfect." And it shows that there were many people in the turn of the century, that there were many peace congresses and congregations of people who said there's got to be another way. And so they were Quakers first. It was a spiritual, faith-based commitment that they made, and their activism flowed from that. And so this is early. He took a while to get to this point, but he sat in in a little office in New York City and typed letters to famous people to convince them to support the Peace Congress. And they had many activities, of course, that my grandfather made an incredible contribution to the family. And later on, my grandmother was part of the Women's Peace Party, and also on the first board of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. But before that, she was a women's rights organizer. But she didn't start out that way, because it was not that easy. It was a big uphill issue going on. And to the left is her best friend, Bess. And Bess did not want to get married. She said it's a bad deal for women. You have to take some guy's name, and you have to promise to obey him, and and she convinced my grandmother not to marry. Well, if my grandmother didn't marry, I wouldn't be sitting here telling you this story, because there were a lot of women around, like Emma Goldman to the right, who basically said, suffrage is just another reform, and they'll dump us, as soon as there's something else comes along. So there was a lot of debate, a lot of disagreement. And it was not easy to step forward and say, I believe in equality, I believe in human rights, I believe everyone should get a square deal. And so we're still saying that over 100 years later. So we stand on strong shoulders, and it's our responsibility. Everyone who's listening to me, I hope you are thinking, gee, am I going to write a book, or am I going to write a poem or a haiku or just a short story about the activism or the commitment or the values of my own family, so that they get passed to the future. For people like me, when I was 10 years old, I wanted to know why I was the way I was and am, and my life has been an example of that. Go on. Here we are. Men. It was extremely important to speak to the men, because the men held a lot of power. And one power they had was to vote yes or no on women's request to win the vote. Women could not vote. Many could not go to school. Many did. It was a very important time in the history of this nation. And in this slide here, we see Harriet May Mills. And Harriet May Mills took Edna under her wing, my grandmother. And Harriet was the president of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association on Madison Avenue in New York City. And she brought many people together, and men were just part of it. It was a coalition. It was a movement that was decentralized. It was extremely hard to pull all of these people together, of many backgrounds and many points of view. There were a lot of arguments, and many women basically said, oh, this political process is not ladylike, and we don't even want to get involved. So it took a lot of talk, it took a lot of persistence, and it was a labor of love. I talk about a statue in Central Park. It was just as much a labor of love then as it is now. And so let's keep going. These are all in my book. This is a suffrage parade in New York City in 1913, and you can see the men in the front. It was not a big group, but it increased over time. And my grandfather, I think that's him in the middle, with a straw hat on. I'm not absolutely certain, because he never showed this to me. I found it in the Library of Congress. But you can see how in the beginning it was a few brave souls, and the crowds were just amazed that these people, stepped out and were in the public domain, basically. And you can see a band behind them, and then you can see behind them many women marching, and it was very different as time went on. They persisted. They were volunteers. They didn't get pay. They had no benefits, and in my family, this was it was just in our DNA. I think it was just something that we did, and this persistent activism. My grandmother knew that the story would never be known unless she took her part in terms of saving leaflets and letters and um, her speeches, her articles. I've got 20 boxes of artifacts and documents to know that when I sat down to write this story, it would be more than what my grandfather told me, but he was important because he was there and he was a participant and he marched. And I think you see a man there with a cane. I think my grandfather is not the one in the front, but the one behind him. But that's my feeling, because when you start to identify all these folks that were part of this movement, it goes on and on and on. There were so many each state had a referendum. There were arguments about, should we go state by state? Should we get a constitutional amendment? Should we get out there and demonstrate? Should we be polite and behind the scenes? Should we hold teas? There were many different ideas and tactics and things happening behind the scenes. And this is a really good example, this slide, of what went on behind the scenes. This is 1913. It was in Washington, D.C. It was the big suffrage parade. And whoa, my grandfather told me the story because he was in the men's division marching in the parade. And he was for sure convinced that there was going to be a riot and there was going to be bloodshed and people were going to die, because it seemed like that the jinx was on. There were a lot of folks who didn't want this to be successful. So this is right before the parade starts. There was no crowd control. The trolleys were still running. The people had not moved to the side of the streets. There were a lot of men who wanted to be at the inauguration parade for Woodrow Wilson, who was going to be inaugurated the next day, and they were in the taverns, and they came out fighting mad because these folks, these women, these uppity women, were going to demonstrate. And so there was a lot of behind-the-scenes activity that I wasn't there for, and my grandparents weren't there in the behind the scenes, but over the years, some of this has come out, and all I can say is that it's a miracle that they all got out of Washington, D.C. alive, because there were many different things that could have happened. For example, where were the black women going to march? And there was a large contingent from Howard University, and then there were people like Ida B. Wells, who was she going to? Where was she going? Where did she fit? And then there were Southern women who basically said, if they march, we're not marching. And I don't know how it all sorted out, but in the middle we see Inez Milholland, who led the parade. And she basically said, if we don't all vote, if we don't all march in the parade, I'm not going to lead the parade. And so there was a lot of pressure that was going on. And she is our suffrage martyr. She died at age 30 in California on a suffrage stage, asking California women to take a position on suffrage in their election. They could vote, and states came in and out accordingly. But Inez was a New Yorker, and so I don't think that most people understand or even know that she died she died in this whole struggle. And so and when you see a photograph a little bit later of my mother's older sister holding a big banner, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? They were referring to Inez and the fact that the women of 100 years ago and more knew that she was their martyr, just as England had a martyr, Emily Davison, and that this movement was not just downhill; it was uphill and around, and it took a lot of issues. It took a lot of time and energy to work out these differences. This is the spirit of 1776. It's the wagon that's now at the New York State Museum. It's been exhibited on several occasions and at the state capitol, but this is shortly after they left the New York State Women's Suffrage Association on Madison Avenue in New York, and they headed to Long Island, and they were going to barnstorm Long Island. And so on the left is my grandmother. In the middle is my mother's older sister, Serena. She was a suffrage movement poster child in New York. And to Serena's right is Irene Davison, who was from Brooklyn. And Irene was president of her suffrage club. And there was a network of suffrage supporters that was incredible. And some of it was behind the scenes. Some of it was out in the open. Some of it was people with their dukes, ready to argue about one strategy or another. This is in July 1913, and they're on their way to basically say, "Hey, let's get into the rural areas. Let's talk to the men. Let's just be present." And so one of the places where they went was Long Beach, New York, and this summer, Long Beach, New York is going to have a ceremony unveiling a historic marker, and this is to the back of the picture is the Hotel Nassau in Long Beach, New York, and there's my grandmother in the wagon with to the far left, and I don't know who is in the middle. She's the mystery woman, but there's my mother's older sister to the far right of the wagon. And this is the only photograph that exists that shows the entire scene of the horse. Even the horse is decorated. And there was a claim that the wagon was built by a patriot in 1776. Well, leave it to me to debunk this story, because when I grew up, I heard from my family members that we were going to be rich someday because of this wagon, and we were going to be celebrated. Well, of course, the wagon wasn't built in 1776. It was more like 1820 or so. But that didn't, and after George Washington had died, because there was a rumor or a legend in our family that George Washington rode in this wagon. Well, that's what I have in the book, all the legends and the stories and the arguments that went on in my family when I was growing up, and so it's a miracle that we finally are making headway. When I started in 2010 to really blog and get into this whole issue, many people couldn't even pronounce the word suffrage, and they certainly didn't know what it meant. And so we've made incredible progress. And when finally 2017 came around, 2017 was the 100th anniversary of New York State women voting. And New York State put on a show. And this is again from my grandmother's collection. I don't know if you can see her little head. That's how I know she was involved, because there's a flag in the front. And there's a little woman you just see her eyes and her hair. That's my grandmother, but you knew she was. This was one of her tactics. It was the strategy was to get out to the public, was to be seen and heard, and because they couldn't vote, they didn't have any political clout. But many people across the nation had their own versions of being seen and heard, or they worked behind the scenes to get their men out into the polls, and they talked and they wrote, and there was many novels and poems and activities and demonstrations and protests. And the spirit of 1776 was also linked to Seneca Falls. New York State is the cradle of the women's rights movement in the United States, and so these are the folks that have come and kept the issue alive, just as we're keeping the issue of peace and activism alive. And this is January 1914. This is they're in New York City. I don't know exactly where, but they're getting ready to march to Albany. When's the last time you marched to Albany? In January. And the little girl in the front, that's my mother's older sister, Serena. And behind my mother's older sister is my grandmother. And the man to the right of the tall guy, that's my grandfather. It was definitely a family affair, but my grandfather said basically, I'm not going to take over here. I'm just here. And I want to make sure that my family stays together. And we're down with this. And he organized his family, his mother, his sister, relatives out in central Pennsylvania. They came to East, and they worked in the campaign in Long Island, and they marched in the parades in Washington, D.C. And here they are, on their way to Albany. There's nothing subtle about what they're doing. There's my mother's older sister, my Aunt Serena, in the middle there, under the flag, and there she is. And then to her left is my grandmother, and the guy with the cane, there's my grandfather again. And I think that there's a lot of men in this picture, because it was not something that women did very often, and they definitely exposed themselves to marching in public along the thoroughfare. I think this is around Yonkers. I'm not exactly sure. But they made sure that they were seen and heard, and that was important. You see the photographer over there. And this is a photograph also from the Library of Congress. They realized that if they didn't tell their own history, that no one was going to tell it. And so these demonstrations and these protests and these photographs really confirm what we heard, or what I heard when I was growing up, and what we're learning now. There's so much material that's just coming out of the archives, or out of the ground, or out of memories, or out of other things. And so this is, to the left is my grandmother in Rockville Centre, New York, in their family home. There's her phone there. I don't know if you can see it, but the phone is there. And she just did nothing else. My grandfather went to work. My mother's older sister, Serena, went to school. And Edna basically was doing her thing. She didn't stop for 10 years. She worked from when she woke up in the morning to when she went to bed at midnight or later. And people called her in the middle of the night also. And to the right is they're out picketing the White House. And so Edna aligned herself not only with organizations like the one for working women from Harriet Stanton Blatch, but also the Harriet Chapman Cass organization in New York to win the vote in 1917. And later she joined the National Women's Party, which is Alice Paul, another Quaker from New Jersey, who organized the big parade in 1913. So she had her fingers in a lot of pies, and I finally had to sit down with myself and basically say, was she a Quaker first, or was she an activist first? And I said, no, she was a Quaker first, because she was committed. She wasn't going to get burnt out by this. She had a realistic assessment, and she did the work, and she was committed to it. And she believed in equality. She believed in social justice. She even had a period of time when she was active in prison issues. And I found this out through the documentation of New York Yearly Meeting, which is in New York City, which is a Quaker yearly meeting. And she and my grandfather were active in the Quaker organization and ministry, actually. So when it keep going on, Ashley is really great. She helped me organize this. And this is my mom. And to the left is my grandmother, Edna, holding my mother as a little kid. And uh, think she was definitely indoctrinated or definitely informed or educated very early, because my mother was a member of Women's Strike for Peace. And so when I was growing up, I heard about strontium 90 and the milk that mothers poured on our cereal in the morning. Was it contaminated by nuclear fallout? This is to the right is a photograph of Women's Strike for Peace demonstrating at the UN in New York City. I have a photograph, but it's a newspaper article of my mother holding signs in the town in which she lived. They just went on and on and on, and my sister will tells wonderful stories about what it was like for her to be in school, and the kids kind of looked at her strange, because my mother was definitely not the spike high heels and nylons type. She was on the airwaves. She was on talk radio talking about peace and peace action, and if she was around today, she would still be doing it, and she probably would have added 10 things to her to-do list as I spoke. And so we spent about 10 years working on the history of the family. And to the left here, I don't know if you can figure that out, but that's me at age 10. And I was definitely interested in my grandmother. I wanted to know everything, and I asked questions. And so when I became an adult, I got a job as a newspaper reporter in Woodstock, New York in the 1980s. And I carried on in the same spirit as my grandmother. I wrote stories about local issues, and I also wrote stories about activism. And one of those stories was about Sojourner Truth. She grew up in the town next to Woodstock, and our town historian, when he covered the history of Woodstock, he talked about women. Women were part of the story. He talked about those who were in bondage. He even had it down to how many were in each town. He covered everything. He asked questions. He ran around with his little index cards. I loved him, Alf Evers, and he knew at that time that a community's history involved everyone, and he definitely made sure that he did that. And so another activity that I was involved in, I worked for 10 years at Hudson River Sloop Clearwater in Poughkeepsie, actually the Beacon, Poughkeepsie area, and to the right at the very top is Pete Seeger, and Pete Seeger and his wife Toshi Seeger were among those activists in the Hudson Valley who basically said, we're going to clean up this river, and we're going to bring the story of activism, environmental activism, to the people. And so I interacted a great deal with Pete because I was co-editor of the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater membership publication. And one day Pete told me that his aunt, Anita, was a suffrage activist. And so here's a photograph of his Aunt Anita right there in the black dress, and she's holding hands, kind of, I'd say holding hands. They're supposed to be shaking hands with Harry T. Byrne. And Harry T. Byrne was in the state legislature of Tennessee. And it came down to one vote. They were split. And Harry T. Byrne basically said, I'm going to change my vote to support the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in Nashville. And of course, this was a big deal. And how does this relate to Pete Seeger? Well, I made him put it in writing because I said, oh, this is too much, this story. He put it in writing that his Aunt Anita clinched the 19th Amendment. Well, that's a pretty outrageous claim. But we found out that his Aunt Anita had dinner with Harry the night before the vote. But the mainstream story is that Harry got a letter from his mother, and his mother said, son, put the rat in ratification, help out Mrs. Cat. I think it was Mrs. Cat Help out Mrs. Cat to put the rat in ratification. I don't remember exactly, but the letter exists. It's in a Tennessee library, and there we are. You scratch the surface, and all kinds of things can come up. And so I found this out myself when I was a reporter in Woodstock, New York. Jane Van de Bogart, who's right there on the right, was on the town council. And I said to her one day, Jane, why do you do this work? Why, what's the big deal here? And she said, I represent the people of Woodstock because of my Aunt Elizabeth. There's a photograph of her Aunt Elizabeth. Aunt Elizabeth Freeman was a suffrage activist, but she also did an anti-lynching tour in the South because for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Aunt Elizabeth Freeman also, she supported Irish independence. She had a long list of causes. She was not just a one-cause person. And also, Aunt Elizabeth knew my grandmother. They were both wagon women. And you can see her, Aunt Elizabeth with her wagon. And Aunt Elizabeth was about one of maybe 5 or 6 what I call wagon women. And they were grassroots activists who went out into the public to basically draw attention to their issue, but also to go into rural areas and speak to the men. And they got a lot of publicity because of this. And so they were not only activists, grassroots activists, but they were also people who were experts. Elizabeth basically got involved in the suffrage movement in England. She was trained by the Pankhursts. She was much more militant than my grandmother, but both of them basically knew each other, worked together, and it's another example. Scratch the surface and you're going to find somebody. Jane and I worked together to get the wagon up from Pennsylvania to New York, and here is the wagon, and I basically had a good experience and a rocky road at times figuring out how to get this wagon out of the clutches of my family and into a public place where people could see it. And it's basic. And here it is at the New York State Capitol in 2012. I took the photograph, and there was a big exhibit of suffrage activists at the state capitol, and it was from Seneca Falls to the Supreme Court. That was the name of the exhibition, and you can see that there was a big poster. There was a lot of work that went into that exhibit, and it continues because the wagon's name was the spirit of 1776, and like the women of Seneca Falls, saying to themselves, "Hey, let's bring the American Revolution into this whole story." The wagon was a representative of what I call patriotic protest. It's not original with me, but before patriotism took on the military slant or definition, patriotic protest was basically, we have a problem, we're going to fix it, rather than my country right or wrong. And so the whole symbolism of this wagon, it was called the Spirit of 1776 because they believed it was built in 1776. But in fact, it was really a symbolic gesture to deeper issues of freedom, justice, and who are we? And so I can say clearly that the unfinished revolution continues, and that's the name of my book. I just tell the story of real people, a real family, and they're not perfect. I tell some secrets and some scandals in the family, and there's a photograph of me to my right, to the left there, taken in 2015. To the right, I call it 4 generations. To the right's my mother. Of course, I wasn't around then, but the photograph was taken in 1921. In the middle is my grandmother, Edna, and there's no question about where she stood in terms of activism and its importance and passing the torch and all those kinds of issues that now we take for granted, but they had to stand strong and alone very often. And then to the far left is my step great 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 grandmother, and Marianne Brooke Buckman, and she married my great 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 grandfather when she was a kid. It must have been, because this is 1921. But she founded the family reunion, the Buckman family reunion, that I was president of in the 1980s, and it was about that time that the reunion was kind of basically closing its doors. I think people had given it so much attention, but it was really the family that had arrived in 1682 from England as the Quakers that came at that time. And so I knew that when I sat down to write the story of my family, that it was an unfinished revolution, and that's why I talk about the importance of telling our stories. Because if we don't tell our stories and don't pass them on, hey, we've missed an opportunity. And when people say, hey, how do we get young people involved? How do we pass the torch? How do we do this? Well, first of all, you got to tell the younger people coming up who you are, why you do what you do, even if it starts yesterday or it starts when you were a kid or 3 years old, or it was something that was carried forward, or perhaps you just have a spiritual ancestor or a spiritual family member who you just adore. You just like, oh my goodness, they're just like hot, and but they're like the conversation that we had before everyone arrived tonight to sit here and listen to all of this. That's making my blood boil, and basically say, hey, we're going to continue, we're going to do more, we're going to carry this on. And so if you didn't feel it, I certainly felt it when I saw the videos of the monumental women's statue in Central Park. There are so many people now that they're knowledgeable about the suffrage movement. They have opinions, even if people don't agree with each other. They have opinions, and they're carrying it on, and we're carrying it to the present, and we're carrying it forward, and we're keeping the issue alive, and we're persisting just as they did. And it's so exciting to be here tonight and to see and feel and remember, and also know that we're part of a long journey to where we are today. And so, bravo, Peace Action New York. Bravo for the house party, and let's see what we can do now for the next 100 years.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. That was terrific. And thank you, Colleen. And I understand there's questions, comments, all comments and questions welcome. We will go forward, shoulder to shoulder, into the future. Hearts open, fists high, with the beloved ancestors to guide us along every way. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Questions, comments?
Blanche, I have one question in the chat that was sent to me about whether Marguerite knows if she is related to Doris Kearns Goodwin, who grew up in Rockville Center, Long Island.
No. But spiritually, I think she's an ancestor.
All right.
Well, a comrade.
Comrade, yes.
Yeah.
So Sylvia, if you want to unmute yourself, you could. I know you have a question for Marguerite. Here's another question. During the Civil War, Sojourner Truth took up the issue of women's suffrage. She was befriended by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but disagreed with them on many issues, most notably Stanton's threat that she would not support the Black vote if women were denied it. Pauline or Marguerite, can you give us any insights into that issue?
Well, I'd be happy to start. Sojourner Truth was, for instance, stated Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house when they had a women's rights convention at Cooper Union. And I have my great grandmother read the newspapers for Sojourner Truth. And so there was a close working relationship. I think one has to see that all three women disagreed with the domination of one sex over another sex. So after the Civil War, the pearly gates opened up, and the question is who's going to enter? And Stanton and Anthony opposed the 14th and 15th Amendment, although they had worked on the 13th Amendment together and supported that. Basically, they were opposed to the fact that when these pearly gates open up, not everybody was going to go through those gates. Only African American men were going to now be enfranchised. And you can imagine that, they had been working 20 years plus on these issues to get the vote, among other rights. So they were very upset that basically it was the African American male who would join the white male in governing all citizens. And so that's the point.
I'd like to add that there were many disagreements and many friendships that survived or didn't survive over these issues, and that there were many, and that it was a very loose coalition that accomplished an incredible thing, which was the 19th Amendment. And it was constant. People did not agree except on one thing, that women should vote. And there's even a part of my grandmother's writing that I've included in the book, and where she said it's very hard to be a suffrage activist. She said, those women, they come to me and I know that they disagreed. They said, oh, those women, they'll never get the right to vote. And she said, but I don't say anything. I just smile and basically say, welcome to the struggle. And it was like, I'm sure it took a lot of patience and a lot of time to work out these problems, or basically just to accept that we don't agree about all these things, but we agree on one thing, and let's stay with that. And I think it's something that we all have to face at one time or another. Where do we draw the line? Or do we also say everyone is capable of change? And sometimes you have to say things or be present 7 to 10 times and say the same thing, but eventually the word gets out, and people change, and people are capable of great change. And we've discovered that in our lifetimes. It's certainly in my lifetime, and it's certainly true of the movement, which was not it was not definitely one group or one point of view. It was many people contributing what they could. They didn't get salaries, they didn't have sick leave, they didn't have pensions. They did it because it was a labor of love, and they had to eat crow at times, but they also extended their arms and their gracious goodwill to what was really important, and that was to win the vote and to make progress. And how do we know if other people are capable of? We don't know, and we have to have faith. And so that's what we're doing. That's why we're here. We're keeping the issue alive, and we're moving into the future, because each stage of this struggle, women's rights, it doesn't end, but it's one group passes the torch to the next group, and the next group picks it up, and they move it into the present day, and they change it, or they mold it in a different direction, but it moves on.
Right. Well, life is about the struggle. And as we can see, with over 250 bills in 43 states to disenfranchise everybody possible by these creatures who follow the creature of Trump, we have our work cut out. Life continues to be about the struggle. March on. And we have peace action to organize with. So grateful to all of you. There are other questions.
I can quickly answer David's question. He asked, how did Inez Mulholland die? And as you remember from the picture that was shown, Inez was on the horse and she led the parade, the major suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913. And it is correct that she came from New York State and she died in California. And I've actually met her relative who still lives in Long Island. And he told me that she died of pernicious anemia. So that's, unfortunate. But one really nice thing is that a mountain in New York State has been named after her, Inez Mulholland Mountain.
There was it was a very delicate but effective coalition of people that worked together, each contributing in many different ways.
Next question.
Okay, we have a question here. If Edna Kearns or Elizabeth Cady Stanton were alive today, what social movement do you think your ancestor would be dedicated to?
Colleen, do you want to start?
Well, this is a quick answer. It's very nice to have the 19th Amendment, which addresses the right of all citizens to vote. Well, that's great that the law of our land has guaranteed the right to vote. But what about all of the other rights? And so Alice Paul in 1923 came up with a solution of this, that right after the 19th Amendment was passed, then she went back to Seneca Falls, what a coincidence, where she introduced the Equal Rights Amendment. And it's great. I think it's equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. It's very simple. It gets away from any sexual discrimination. And I don't call this, the women's right to equal pay and things like that. I really think amendments to the U.S. Constitution have to be very broad and something that's impactful over hundreds of years. And so this addresses discrimination based on sex. And I think that it hasn't passed. We're going to celebrate its 100th anniversary of being introduced in 2023. So let's have another party celebrating its passage. Thank you.
It's very close to being passed, and the time limit has been removed. Carol Jenkins is heading up the ERA coalition right now, and it is very close to actually being passed. We should all put some effort into that. Thank you so much. Next, Marguerite, would you like to say what?
Well, I think that the one thing that I think my grandmother would definitely be interested in climate issues and what we should be doing to eliminate the barriers to cooperation on a planetary level. She would be very concerned about climate change. She would be concerned about equal rights of all people to participate in a democratic process. She would be definitely, she would be surprised to know how much people today are influenced by those who've come before us. Because in my family, and I'm sure it's true in Colleen's family too, is that the intergenerational activism and participation has definitely, been an important part of my heritage and my learning about the world. And
Right.
so we have to keep passing the torch and to realize that things change over time, and that that many things that we thought were going to be slam dunk aren't, and we have to be vigilant and stand up for what we believe in. And strong backbone, carry on.
I would like to comment on Joanne's comment. And Joanne, we spoke previously. I just think it's amazing. The Delta Sigma Theta, which is a sorority that was formed at Howard University just months before the march in Washington, D.C., 1913. Well, these about 40 women that were students needed to have a chaperone to get off the campus to go to that march. And fast forward 100 years later, I went down to Washington, D.C. to recreate that march. And when I got there, I was overwhelmed by thousands of Deltas that showed up, because this, of course, is their 100th anniversary as well. And the power of those women was astounding. What they had accomplished with their lives. One was a judge from Tennessee. Another one was chair of the psychology department of Morehouse College. Another woman was a teacher down in Georgia, and I connected with her children, remotely. So I really am very optimistic that about our future.
Thank you. That's great. Jim, you had your hand up at some point. You're muted. You got to unmute.
Actually, I was thumbing up all the comments they were making, but since I got the mic, I did have a kind of a question. They touched on it already, and I was wondering, are there any particular racial situations that occurred or challenges that you could share? You already kind of answered that already, but that was my kind of question I had.
Colleen?
Well, it's basically a very long revolution. If you want to study military history, usually the military histories are bloody messes, with war, 4 years, 5 years, 18 years of murder and killing. But this is a revolution that lasted 72 years. And just to put things in perspective, Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1902. She died 18 years before the federal amendments. So it's, one has to put in time. And about race, it's very interesting. She had a bond with Frederick Douglass, basically for their lifetime, until death did them part. And interestingly, Frederick Douglass stayed at Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house. And they were psychologically and philosophically very supportive of each other. And the truth is that you cannot discuss any one type of human rights without starting to discuss other human rights.
They are all connected.
It is.
Yeah, human rights are connected, and we are one world. At some point, we will all recognize that. Thank you. Marguerite?
Well, it's amazing that the obstacles confronting the women and men who participated in the movement of all backgrounds and types did this in spite of the fact that our social structure was a hierarchy, with certain people at the top and certain people at the bottom, and it just birthed a lot of hatred and craziness and division, and that many people, in fact everybody in one way or another, is contaminated by that social structure. It's top down and versus horizontal, which I say is much more equal. It approaches it this way rather than this way. And so the women and men who basically were concerned about the issues of equality and social justice said, we're not going to wait until we work this out. We got to go ahead with all the disadvantages and the advantages that were available at that time. And so they did. And of course, it came back to bite them in many ways. And they could not have anticipated some of the messes that they were that they had to face. But eventually it happened, and no one fired a shot. Inez Milholland died as she was speaking about women's rights on a stage in California of pernicious anemia. Yeah, and so she basically pushed herself, and she went from podium to podium to podium, and knew that she didn't feel good, but basically she just kept doing it. She said, I have to do this. Like, we persist today. Sally was basically saying what it was like today to go to a demonstration about the 18th anniversary of the Iraq War, and we all of us push ourselves into areas and to arenas that maybe are a little bit over our head, but we do it anyway. We make mistakes. We say things that, well, I shouldn't have said that, but anyway, we keep doing it, and it's going to continue because there's more people aware today of the big complex situation that we face and the need to work together. And so I'm optimistic too. And so
well, as Eleanor Roosevelt would say, pessimism is politically incorrect. And we have to be optimistic. Failure is impossible. Is Joanne on here? Sally, you said.
Yeah, here she is. And you're unmuted, Joanne. So we're about ready to wrap up, and you're unmuted, so we should be able to hear you, Joanne.
Thank you so much. I don't know, have you talked about one of the most interesting evenings we've had in the Women's History Month and how we are supporting it through the Peace Action Movement? And we even have a young woman, I don't know, Emily Rubino, who has she been talked about? Emily?
She's our new, yes.
Did you discuss Emily? Because
he's our new.
At the beginning, I dropped off. But I would like to thank you and to continue your support of Peace Action. It's wonderful. You cannot imagine how much we appreciate it, and that your financial support helps us to promote our mission and to keep all of the college chapters going and to keep the work that we do and to promote the issues of peace and in understanding of people. And without you, we couldn't exist. Without your financial support, we could not exist. And if you're so inclined to continue helping us, we don't mind if you give us a few more shekels, if you have that heart to do so. But we truly thank you so much, because without you, we cannot exist. We cannot work with our college chapters. We cannot do the work that we do in promoting peace. We cannot put out our wonderful newsletters. And Emily, who sets policy, who interprets it and gets it out to the public, educates students here and abroad. We are so proud. So help us continue, help us with this wonderful, wonderful organization. Continue giving us your financial love, your financial generosity, and it will continue to make us stronger and you stronger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. Emily, would you like to say a word?
Sure, just quickly.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I am really grateful to work with such an incredible organization, and nothing that I do or that Desiree does or that Ashley does, because it's not just me, it's not a one-woman show. None of it would be possible without your support, and we have some truly incredible students that Desiree's working with every day. Ashley's really stepped up with our comms work. Our website is looking better than I think it's ever looked. So all of this is not possible without everyone's love and support, but also financial contributions. So I learned a lot tonight, and I hope that you will all continue to support us and let leaders like all of our great student organizers grow. And I grew in this network. I started out as an intern here, I think 5 years ago at this point. So, you know, we really are committed to growing the next generation of peace leaders, and appreciate your help and support in doing that.
Thank you, Emily. What may I call on you, Ashley, just to say a word as well? You've been doing so much.
Sure. Yeah, it's been really exciting putting this event together. I've learned a lot, especially working with Marguerite about topics I hadn't read about before. So that's been really enriching. And I'm so glad we can all come here and celebrate, I guess, 4 to 5 generations of really strong women getting things done. So, yeah. And thanks everyone for attending and for your support.
Really wonderful. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who would like to say anything? Sylvia?
We want to thank you, Blanche. Thank you very, very much. Thank everybody who came, and you'll hear from us. We've got more things coming up.
Yeah.
So
thank you
stay
so
tuned.
much. And I want to thank Colleen and Marguerite for your splendid work. Carry on forward into the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and we'll send out more information about how to get the book. I did put it in the chat, but everybody who attended will send you a link, and you have a discount code to get it.
Great.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.